Okay, well, without further ado, let me introduce Mick Pope to you. Mick is a lecturer in meteorology and an adjunct professor at a number of theological institutions. He has a background in mathematics, in meteorology and theology, and he wrote his MPhil on human and non-human agency in the Hebrew Bible as applied to the Anthropocene. And this afternoon, he's going to be talking to us about reenchanting nature in a techno-scientific world. Thanks, Mick.
Thank you. I'd like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging that we meet in Naarm, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's a land of age-old ceremony and wisdom that we need to tap into if we're to re-enchant nature in a techno-scientific world. The present ecological crisis has many names and can be identified by its many different aspects. Viewed as a new geological era, the Anthropocene represents a departure from the relatively stable climatic conditions over the past 11,700 years, known as the Holocene. The rates of change in various Earth system parameters due to human influence are larger than natural processes observed over long timescales. The arrival of the Anthropocene demonstrates that the Baconian narrative of mastery over nature is largely illusory, because while humanity has been able to manipulate nature for its own ends, the results of this manipulation have exceeded our control. It is the result of many small choices taken by individuals, communities, governments, corporations, and others, which cumulatively have a large and possibly irreversible effect or impact. While then human agency may be exercised unconsciously or consciously of its impacts on the Earth, Dipesh Chakrabarty argues that the Anthropocene reminds us that our agency is not unique. Agency in the Earth system, he observes, is distributed in, quote, Earth processes, technology, humans, and other species. Chakrabarty describes geological history as, quote, a narrative of many dispersed and networked actors, none acting with a sense of internal autonomy with which humanist historians suffuse the word agency. He also notes that all actors are, quote, always in a relationship, synodoke, that's a word I can never say, to the distributed agency of the Earth processes. In the Anthropocene, these relationships may be represented by the negative value that capital accumulation produces, hence the preferred phrase by some of Capitalocene. Hence, Ewa Bińczyk defines human hyperagency as our ability as a species to change the climate while still being, quote, enmeshed in the process of planetary metabolism. This metabolism is turning against us as the nurturing Mother Earth becomes the uncontrollable other. In the face of the effects of our hyperagency, we see more signs of more of the same. For example, astrophysicist Adam Frank argues that the Anthropocene is merely a stage of the development of civilization that the human creature must pass through as we learn to harvest the energy of the entire planet. This is Bacon on steroids. To understand our own place in the world means attempting to understand that world. The rest of this paper examines the Hebrew Bible's view of Mother Earth as divinely infused with agency, rights, and responsibilities. My analysis is limited to the priestly creation account of Genesis 1 and the Holiness Code of Leviticus 17 to 26, the work of the latter Holiness or H school, concerned with the holiness of lay Israelites. These texts present a view of the world as our co-created partner, to which we have relationship and responsibilities that transcend our exercise of technological power on the world. Instead, in this re-enchanted world, we are to navigate through the Anthropocene together. The creation in the priestly account is seen by Jewish scholar John Levinson as a drama, with real actors both human and non-human. In particular, the earth, in Hebrew the eretz, which is initially formless and void, is declared good at each stage of its ordering. God names what God creates and separates what already exists. God engages with creation as an active covenant partner. As Terence Thretheim observes, divine creating entails a, quote, speaking with that which is already created. The priestly author uses adjussive let, leaving room for creaturely response. This is evident in the fruitfulness of the earth as it brought forth vegetation, verse 12, in response to the command to do so in verse 11, and living creatures apart from humans in verses 24 and 25. Such bringing forth, the Hebrew word yatzar, is also used to describe Ruth's bringing out to Naomi the results of her gleaning in Ruth 2, and God bringing Israel out of Egypt in Jeremiah 32. This approach then emphasises what Michael Velker describes as the, quote, connectedness and cooperation of creator with that which is creaturely. This understanding of creation cooperating with the creator with its own sense of agency has been resisted by some exegetes, although it has a long-standing support in the theological tradition. As Mari Eurstadt correctly observes, any resistance to the creation's participation comes from the dualistic assumption that creation must either be divinized or inanimate. The former assumption is avoided by Christians due to fear of syncretism, which in turn leads them to accept the latter. That divine speech is directed to both animate and inanimate creation in Genesis 1 implies that such dualism does not belong to the narrative world. Volker concludes then, quote, the creature's own activity, which itself is a process of production, is not only a consequence and result of a creation that is already completed, rather it is embedded in the process of creation and participates in that process. Such an insight reflects the Holiness Code's presumption that creation is unstable and that its unfolding is inherently risky. This is particularly evident in human misagency in the Anthropocene. In the Hebrew Bible, the rejection of the divinization/inanimate dualism extends to the land itself. Leviticus is a potential source of material for ethical reflection on the mutual responsibilities of Israel and the land, specifically in Sabbath keeping. The Sabbath is linked to creation, so Exodus 31:17 and Genesis 2:1-3, and cannot be for human rest alone. In the creation account, as in Exodus 31, the heavens and the earth is a merism for all that exists. The eretz represents the dry land, which brings forth plants and living creatures, as I discussed earlier. In H, the Holiness author, eretz refers to the land which the people enter and tend, or the land of Egypt from which they were rescued. The seventh year Sabbath is portrayed as being for the land, also to take a complete rest, in Hebrew the Shabbat, Shabbaton. The land must observe a total cessation to Yahweh, that is the Lord, from its customary vocation. That the land is active in Sabbath keeping rather than the passive recipient of human Sabbath observance is suggested by comparison with Leviticus 23:32, where the people are to celebrate your Sabbath, but observe the Sabbath and celebrate your Sabbath are both the same in the Hebrew. The same Hebrew phrase is applied to the animate and the inanimate, but it's translated differently each time. The land has a relationship with Yahweh that precedes that between Israel and Yahweh, although now Israel and land share the same covenant with Yahweh. Indeed, H stresses the divine ownership of the land over any Israelite claim. There is a parallel between Leviticus 25 and the priestly creation story. The creation of the earth, the eretz earth, by God precedes that of the Adam, humans, just as Yahweh has prior relationship with the eretz land before the arrival of Israel. The Adam is the divine image bearer, is blessed to multiply, to subdue the eretz, that is for agriculture, and have dominion. The Adam is the divine image bearer in God's creation with the implied responsibility to allow all the land to enjoy the Sabbath. This Sabbath keeping was a reminder of the divine ordering of the initial chaos. Hence, Israel's responsibility to keep the Sabbath is exercised in the context of divine ownership of both the people and the land. In Leviticus 25 verses 4 and 5, there is a prohibition on the people of Israel from sowing, pruning or reaping because the seventh year is set aside as a complete rest for the land. While agricultural activity is forbidden, there was provision for gathering from what the land yields during this time. This rest is part of the divine order and hence the responsibility of Israel to ensure it occurs by its own Sabbath observance. A further active role for the land is described in Leviticus 18 verses 24-28, wherein the land is portrayed, as Jan Houston observes, as a, quote, living being with its own personality and, quote, an entity distinct from its inhabitants. Whether or not this personification is overstated, the land is active in judging Israel for its failure to keep the covenant. In verses 24 and 25, the people are warned not to defile themselves as did the nations, the Goyim, in the land before them, and this in turn defiles the land. As a result of this transfer of defilement, the land is punished, quote, for a failure to fulfill its obligation to God. Yahweh visits judgment, the Hebrew word pakad, not on the iniquity of the land's inhabitants, but on the iniquity of the land. Of the 302 occurrences of pakad in the Hebrew Bible, it is only used with the land as a direct or indirect object in one other place. This judgment in turn flows from land to inhabitants. Yahweh is not described as judging inhabitants of the land. Instead, the land vomited out the nations. This vomiting out is a warning, quote, lest the land vomit you out when you defile it, a warning to the Israelites and perhaps a warning to us in the Anthropocene. There appears to be a two-way transfer occurring. Defilement is transferred from the inhabitants to the land, and the consequences of judgment are transferred from the land to the inhabitants. Such a vomiting out would be a break in the good order that Israel experienced while in the land. The goal of this vomiting out is rest for the land. While Israel is in exile in the land of its enemies, the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths, making up for the times it did not rest on the Sabbaths of the Israelites. Leviticus 26, verses 34-35. The verb ratzah, enjoy, occurs 57 times in the Hebrew Bible, 9 times in H, and 5 times in Leviticus 26. It is used often to describe divine pleasure or its lack in sacrifices. It is also used of the favour of individuals or groups of people. Its use for the land, therefore, is significant. The sense in verse 34 is that of enjoyment of Sabbath rest. In verse 41, it's used of the people accepting their guilt in the sense of making amends, as it leads to Yahweh remembering the covenant and eventual return from exile. Finally, ratzah is used twice in verse 43. Applied to the people, it is usually rendered make amends, but when applied to the land, it is translated either as enjoy or make amends. Given that the land has been punished for its iniquity, either reading is possible. The land could be required to make up for its lost Sabbaths as a debt to Yahweh. The pairing with ratzah for the people is suggested without being conclusive. The main point is that language used of Yahweh and humans is once again applied to non-humans, that is, either enjoy or make amends in a similar way to Yahweh and Israel. Therefore, the land is possibly being personified as having emotional experiences, if not the ascribed agency and responsibility to make amends with Yahweh as part of a covenant relationship. Either way, the exile restored the land to its covenant observance. Of principal importance here is verse 42, where Yahweh promises to remember his covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, but also to remember the land. Jonathan Morgan understands this to mean that the land is not simply, quote, a stage on which the drama of covenant unfolds, but is itself a character that participates, quote, in a web of mutually obligated covenant relationships with Yahweh and with the people. While there are obvious covenant obligations to keep the Sabbath, Leviticus 26:42 does not describe a covenant between the land and Yahweh, in contrast with the threefold usage applied to the patriarchs. However, the status of the land as mine, in contrast to Israel as aliens and tenants, identifies a pre-existing relationship. The mutual covenant of Israel and the land with Yahweh is implicit in their shared need to keep the Sabbath. Israel's observance of the Sabbath, quote, leaves space for the land to practice its obedience to Yahweh. Hence, Israel's agricultural activities and Sabbath practices are constrained by the need for the land to observe its own Sabbath. Now, I have little doubt that some of you are questioning such an understanding. Surely the Bible writers were adopting symbolic language, employing metaphor. However, if we find resonance between such texts and the understanding of Indigenous peoples globally, should we be surprised? Should an agrarian society observing the world more closely than urbanite products of the Enlightenment come to radically different conclusions? Our choices are then either to deny any hint of animism in the Bible, or accept that it's there and reject it together with Indigenous epistemologies, or accept perhaps our own epistemologies are inadequate or at least incomplete. Is not the Anthropocene evidence of this? Cherokee scholar Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley observes that Western Christian concerns over syncretism with Indigenous theologies trade in the self-righteous view, quote, to say that there's a pure theology and that it's ours. Potawatomi botanist Robin Kimmerer encourages to, quote, learn the grammar of animacy. Our world is full of verbs, not nouns, beings who are kinning, that is, engaging in kinship relationships. With the extinction of Indigenous languages comes the loss of the grammar of animacy, together with the wisdom of living with Mother Earth. The dispossession and severing a relationship between people and soil links ecocide, the destruction of whole ecosystems, to genocide, the destruction of whole people groups. Loss of language is part of the genocidal process of colonisation, which continues to this day. The priestly worldview provides one path that can contribute to the decolonising of Christianity in countries like Australia. As the late Graham Paulson observes, Western Christianity has often understood the earth as adversary to be subdued, and I think that's a misreading of Genesis 1, 26 to 28, or as resources for human use, or as terra nullius, to be divided up. Hence the essential nature of beginning a conference like this with an acknowledgement of country. For Aboriginal Christians, to decolonise Christianity is to, quote, pay respects to the spirituality that has long been attuned to the divine presences in this land, end quote, which is to recognise the animistic spirituality that has, quote, shaped respectful attitudes to the created order. Now, of course, further work is required to establish whether the priestly world is animistic in any meaningful sense, or at least consistent with such a conception. It is worth noting that some philosophers have turned to the concept of panpsychism, which sees intention in all matter, with consciousness in more complex beings. Philosophers such as Thomas Nagel and Philip Goff use panpsychism to explain the mystery of consciousness while rejecting both materialism and theism. However, Catholic theologian Edward Oakes suggests that just as the limited number of aerodynamic streaming of wings suggests the presence of air, so the convergent evolution of intelligence suggests the existence of what he calls the mental air, the presence of a guiding intelligence in the universe, hence panentheism. Mind is in everything because God is immanent mind. So very briefly then, how might such an idea be applied in practice to re-enchant our world? Increasingly, whole ecosystems are being granted human legal status. I mean, if you can do that for a company, why not a watershed, for example? In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Wanganui River has been granted the rights of a legal person. Ecuador's constitution recognises the rights of nature, while Bolivia recognises the rights of Mother Earth. Now, whether or not Christians could recognise Earth as mother in any meaningful way based on the priestly imaginary or on, say, Paul's writings is worth further examination. However, the animistic hints in a number of biblical texts, and I've only discussed a few briefly this afternoon, are suggestive that we are not the only beings with agency and rights to be respected, and that perhaps we have much to learn from our Indigenous family in how to both read and apply these familiar texts as we seek to navigate the Anthropocene that we, in the West, with capitalism and our epistemologies, have created. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful and clear and thought-provoking talk. Stay there. Yeah. We're going to ask you questions now. Come and put the mic. Feel free to continue to pop questions into Slido. Stream 7 is the password, but we do have 2 questions already. So Neil asks you, does the land, in inverted commas, include its non-human animals, plants? Should these also have rest, worship God, keep the covenant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think technically Eretz is used to refer either to the land of Israel or the earth itself, but it's also very clear from the Jubilee year and the Sabbath rest that, for example, you don't touch the agricultural land, and so the wild animals can come in and eat from that. So yeah, it's meant to be all-inclusive ultimately. You can chase in Genesis 1 and 2 are very, I guess, a couple of family trees, if you will, which is something I've done Toledot for those who understand the Hebrew for generations of, and we're very much part of that, and they're very much related to us too. So it is an all-inclusive concept, I think.
Fantastic. Second question, which is behind you as well. Mark 2, verse 27. Can you comment on this regarding the land and Sabbath?
Well, by the time you get to, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look in H and H-like text, that's the Holiness School, it gets really savage I think it's in Exodus 31, don't quote me on that, where if you don't observe a complete observance of the Sabbath of Shabbaton, you can be stoned to death, right? That's a little bit harsh. So the idea that ultimately Sabbath is created for human benefit in that context is not exclusive of the idea that it's not created for non-human benefit, but in that context that where the Pharisees in particular were so obsessed with, well, how do we bring in the kingdom of God? And it's by strong adherence to the law, you create fences around it. So I guess, Jesus in that context is saying, oh, chill out, dudes, a little bit. That's a paraphrase, right? That it's not just rigid legalism, but what's the point, the intent of the law? How does your talk engage with the idea of Genesis 1 as perhaps polemic against broad polytheistic worldviews, stripping the stars of divinity? Yeah, that's a really good point. Very, very clearly it does, but it goes back to the comment I made earlier. You don't have to choose between an either or. Just because they're clearly de-divinized in the text doesn't mean that they become inanimate. They're all creations of the one good God, and it's a one good creation. That is, it's all functioning as it should be initially. So there shouldn't be a tension between those two options. That's not quite what I mean to say. You don't need to embrace one because you rejected the other. There's a middle path.
Okay.
All right.
One more, because I think we can do it in 3 minutes. Leviticus 26:42 describes covenants with the people, but not explicitly with the land. Is this true?
Yeah, I'm arguing that it's by implication, that God remembers the covenant with the patriarchs and he remembers the land in the same sentence. And the fact that they're both called to Sabbath observance, Sabbath being part of the covenant with Israel, in my mind, means that the land is included in the covenant. And people often talk about initial creation covenant too, as wrapping that up. You look at the very end of the priestly creation story in Genesis 1, 2 and 3, and you're not given the instruction to keep the Sabbath, but the day is declared holy, and it's the completion of the entire creation, suggesting very strongly to me that the rest is inclusive of all creation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mick.
Thanks, everyone.
Please join me in thanking Mick for his talk. Wonderful.